Subscribe now and press the bell icon. Never miss an update.
Now you've got to remember, this is 1912, and my grandfather's a Brahmin. And if you would recall in those days, for a Brahmin girl to be going anywhere without family around her was very rare. But my grandfather was he was a far-thinking man. It looks like, because I never met him. So this couple says, we'll send her to a very good English girls' public school. We'd like to take her to England, let her have the benefit of a good education. And my grandfather, later on, he tells his daughters, you're not going to get a dowry, but you're going to get an education. You know, that was his way of looking at his daughters. So anyway, he, don't ask me why, agrees to let Malti go with this couple by sea, because in those days there were no airplanes. And he agrees for her to go. So now they're a theosophical couple. The father, her father is interested in theosophy. So theosophy is sort of in the mix. And so Malti goes with this couple in about 1912 and so to England. And this couple, because they're theosophists, they're interested. They go to these meetings on a monthly basis where Annie Besant is the president of the Theosophical Society. Now it has nothing to do with education, but this is a part of the interesting story that I think will interest you. So, the Raja of Sangli's son, not the one who becomes the Raja, but the second son, is at Cambridge. He is in Cambridge going to university. My father is at London University, going to university, all at the same time. My father is interested in theosophy. I don't know whether the Raja of Sangli's son was interested in theosophy, whether he was interested in Malti. I don't know that part, okay? But anyway, he comes to these meetings. And my father comes to these meetings and they become friends. And because Raja of Sangli, tutor to his children was my grandfather, the children of my grandfather, Malti and Malti being the oldest, played with the children of the Raja. You know, they just played in the garden together when they were young. So obviously, the Sangli royal family already knew the family of my family. And so when he comes to these meetings, my father, you know, they're friends. This is this friend of, this is Malti Paranse, and they just meet. But the reason I'm telling you all this is that, as it turns out, my father met Malti way before he meets my mother, which is coming later. So now they have met. And fast forward, Malti is 17, and the Raja of Sangli's son goes to my grandfather and asks if he could have Malti's hand in marriage. So this is, and the family name is Patwardhan. The Sangli family name is Patwardhan. And the arranged marriages were, obviously they're still common, but they were pretty common in those days. And for a commoner, to be asked if the Raja of Sangli's son would marry them, it was a big deal. So I think my grandfather probably he felt happy that this would happen. I'm not sure whether Malti wanted it, but she obeyed her father. And so Malti became married into the Raja's family. Now, why did I tell you this story about Malti and all that stuff? Well, because having met Malti and having met Annie Besant and Malti gave my father access to the inner parts of the Brahmin family, because in those days an Englishman couldn't get to know the inner parts of a family. He now becomes friends with the Paransways. And so this is a picture, this photograph of my father. My father is, now you remember he started the Boy Scouts in Ceylon. So he goes to these annual meetings. And the British will not let Indians become Boy Scouts. So he becomes, he's had success in Sri Lanka, Ceylon. So he comes to Annie Besant and says, what he does is he talks to Annie Besant, and Annie Besant said, I think it's a good idea, let's try it. And so he goes from village to village and trains the village elders. The purpose of the scout troop is to provide seva within the community. Skills of first aid, all the things that Boy Scouts learn to do. And each village pays for his third-class ticket to the next village. So there's not much money being spent, it was just being done on this basis. And he goes from village to village to village between 23 and about 5 years. And in 5 years' time, there are like 20,000 Boy Scouts all over India. And of course, this was, so what is now happening is Baden-Powell, who, I don't know if you know anything about the scouting movement, Lord Baden-Powell was the man who started scouting. And he was part of the reason why the British would not let our Indians join. So I think he finally realizes that it's better to have the Indian Boy Scouts inside the tent rather than outside the tent. And so he approaches my father. By that time, my father had become the first commissioner of scouts for the Indian Boy Scouts. And this was given to my father by the scouts when so this is a hand-drawn, and you can see they're dressed in Indian, safas and, Indian kinds of ways. So my father wanted to clearly make it abundantly clear to the British that, yeah, it's a good idea, but you better not look down on the Indians. So Baden-Powell comes to my father and says, would you consider joining the bigger movement? He was not the bigger movement, because his was the bigger movement at that time. Krishna Menon, the first defense minister of India, was a scoutmaster under my father. So as you can see, he did more than start schools. And I don't know how he had the energy. I mean, here's a man who's 28, 29, 30. And as you will see, he not only did he do all this, he was doing other things. In 1927-28, my father's reputation had begun to be known in more places than one. And it began to be known that he had this concept started in Mahindra College, of taking the best parts of the British public school system, but making it Indian. And the Maharaja Scindia contacted my father, and he had a school that he had in Gwalior. It was on the top of a fort, and this is one of the buildings in the fort. It's a 300-acre land in this old fort that was built in the 6th century. It's a beautiful place. And the barracks, which used to be army barracks, had been turned into a school by the Gwalior Maharaja, and it was called the Sardar School because only open to the nobles. So my father said to the Maharaja, when he asked if he could help, I will come, but you must agree that this school must be open to all. And so in that period, he was there from 1928. He was there for quite a long time, from 1928 to about 1941-42. And my father was never a man who wanted to be in the limelight. He, as I said, everything was by consensus. So what he does after he puts everything together is he calls the headmasters or the principals of Doon School. You may have heard of Doon School. And Mayo College, you may have heard of Mayo College. These are, there are schools that were based on that sort of British idea, but had not yet formally, he created a standard. and he's in on the fort, on the top of the fort, which is overlooking Gwalior city, and he's there for about 10 years, 10, 11 years, and this is the period of time where he doesn't. I mean, not only this, he's writing while he's doing all this, and a lot of his books were translated eventually into many languages, into Hindi and Tamil and Telugu, because he wanted people in non-English public schools could use these books. My father now is in Gwalior. In 1927, 1928, Scindia has called him to start the school, and he's in Gwalior. In the meantime, my grandfather, my mother's father, in 1926 had a massive heart attack and he dies. So he's a principal of this college, and my mother and my grandmother have to leave because, he's no longer the principal of the college. And they have friends or relatives in Gwalior. So independent of my father, my mother and grandmother go to Gwalior. Now, by this time, in 1926, my mother was born in 1907, so she's 18, 19 years old. She's no longer that little girl who was running around in Adyar. She's now a woman. And of course, because he knows them, he goes to pay his respects to them at where they are staying. And so he gets to meet my mother, now a woman, and they fall in love. And he asks my grandmother for her hand in marriage. And she says, no, well, this is crazy. An Englishman marrying a Brahmin, this doesn't work. So my mother, obviously, she says to her mother, of course I will obey you, but don't try to find me a husband. I'm not going to marry anybody else. But what I would like to do is I'd like to make sure that I have a profession that will allow me to take care of you. And many of you probably have heard of the Montessori system. And Madame Montessori was at that time in England and had just begun to, the Montessori school had become sufficiently interesting to people that people now have begun to know about it. So my mother, as it turns out, I found out later that she took a loan. My father offered a loan so that she could go to England, because of course, her father had died, so there was money was not easy to get to. So anyway, my father helps my mother go to England, and here she is. This is my mother on the left-hand side. This is Madame Montessori, and you can see that she was pretty powerful. She got everybody to dress up in Indian clothes in England. And so she comes back now. Now she has a degree from Madame Montessori herself, and my father decides to try again. He goes back, and this time my grandmother says yes. And so in 1930, my parents, would-be parents, go to Darjeeling and they get married. My mother, I would say, was the second Brahmin to marry an Englishman. The first one was somebody called Rukmani Shastri, who became Rukmani Irondale, who was part of the Theosophical Society. The school's running well, everybody knows about the Scindia school, and so he says, will you come down and help us do a little bit more and take over this college that they have in Gwalior? And about a year later, he goes down, and now it's, I guess, mid-30s. So this photograph was taken in 1945, and Jay and Vijay and I at this stage are 13 years old because they were born in 1932, and I was born in 1942, so I'm about 3. So this photograph was taken in 1945. My two brothers who were born while my parents were in Scindia school, Jay and Vijay, and this is me. So they went to Scindia school because they were of the right age, because my father started Scindia school in the 1928-29. These two were born in 1932, so they were the right age to fit into the school, and they eventually, both of them, graduated from Scindia school. My brother Jay would eventually go to Banaras Hindu University and became a metallurgical engineer. And my brother Vijay was supposed to have gone to join the Indian Navy, but he got typhoid and he couldn't sit for the exam, so he joined the Indian Merchant Navy. And he had another career, a successful career in the Navy. This is Jay and Vijay. They were not identical twins. They were, the kind of twins where they don't look alike at all. Now we're in 1945, 46. It's becoming clear that India is going to be independent. It's not happened yet, and the Birlas get in touch with my father, who by this time has become the education minister for Gwalior State. And the Birlas get in touch with my father and say, we have this similar kind of school to Nainital. We bought this old British school that's been closed for some time. Will you come and make it a public school? So in 1946, my father and mother and I, we go to Nainital. Birla Vidya Mandir is in Nainital. And this is just, it's, again, and it's about 75 acres of land up on top of a hill. It's about 7,500 feet up above sea level. This was the second public school that my father started. But he was only there for a couple of years. And while he was there, he gets contacted by now it's 1948, India got her independence in 47. A year later, Ceylon gets its independence in 48, and they contact my father and say, can you come to Ceylon, now called Sri Lanka, can you come and help us reorganize the education system in Sri Lanka? So he becomes Secretary of Education to the Ministry of Education in Ceylon, and now my memories have started. I remember a little bit about Gwalior, but I remember more about life starting about this time. About a year into the contract with the government, J. Krishnamurthy, I don't know if many of you have heard of J. Krishnamurthy, he's the philosopher who initially came out of the Theosophical Society, and Annie Besant was the one who found him, and he contacts my father and says, we've got this school, it's been closed for a while, if you don't come and do something with it soon, we'll have to turn it into something, usual stuff. So my father much preferred connecting with children, more than he liked the big jobs, the administrative jobs. He did them, but it was not what he really enjoyed. I think he enjoyed the hands-on thing that happens in a school. So anyway, he broke his contract, and we left for India and Rishi Valley. So this was the second school where he spent considerable amount of time. Sandhya School was the first, and this was the second where he spent like 10 years. And his stature, of course, meant that he got some very great teachers to want to come and teach in the school. And also, by this time, the idea that we can teach children not by lecturing, but by giving them things to do that they enjoy. How about a project? We'll have a project, we're going to grow a garden. And in the process of growing a garden, we'll say to the teacher, because of joint teaching, how many square feet is this plot? And so you calculate how many square feet, and so you learn math. This is the school to which I went. I went and I did my senior Cambridge in Rishi Valley, and then subsequently I went to school in England, another public school in England, then I went to university in England. And one of the things he realizes is that when children are young, how do they learn? They learn by play. They play, and while they play, they're learning things. They're learning things about the world. They're learning things, right? And why do they play? Because they enjoy it, right? So he began to think, how can we make learning fun? And he thought, by engaging them in ways that is not a lecture, which is kind of only going through the ear, you know? How can we involve them in multiple ways? Tasting it, dancing it, singing it, as well as how can we incorporate multiple facets of what we all need, but in a way that is by doing. And so he began to think about project-based learning, where you have, let's say, for example, I'm going to have a lesson which is supported by a geography teacher, a chemistry teacher, an English teacher, and a math teacher. They design something like this, okay? They say, let us make a garden. And so the garden is 10 meters by 5 meters, or whatever the size is. So then the question you ask the child is, we have to put some fertilizer on this garden because it's, you know, we want the things to grow well. And how much fertilizer do you think we want to make it this thick around this area? How do we determine how much we need? So the concept of multiplying and creating how many square feet something is, they internalize it. They understand how you do it, not because somebody told them that you do it this way. They are figuring it out because they are interested in the project. And then you plant food and the pH of the soil is not right. So you teach chemistry because now they understand that if you put lime in the grass, it changes the pH. So they learn chemistry. And so in the process of doing, they're learning. And that is the kind of learning people never forget. It doesn't go in one ear and out the other because they're doing it, right? And so what I'm trying to say to all of you as you start to think about, where does NETARHAT go from here? Let's talk about some of the things that we could just as easily be done. And it can be done anywhere, right? It just means that we have to give people, the teachers, the opportunity to try new things, right? And when you do that, it gets them excited. Not only that, how do you get parents to want to come to NETARHAT and send their children here? The message must go out that a residential school has certain benefits that you will never get in a day school. And if that is not absorbed by the parent, they're not going to, even if you charge them large fees, they're not going to want to do it. The other thing, which is a little controversial, but I'll bring it out to you guys anyway. So in 1952, 53, I think it was Mathur who got interested in seeing whether my father could. Was it J.C. Mathur?
13th December 1951.
So he contacts my father, and they start to talk, about, can we do something? And of course, what my father really wanted is he wanted a public school that had an Indian flavor, but also was open to everybody no matter how much you could afford. Because unfortunately, all these schools, these boarding schools, you have to be fairly rich to be able to send your child to this school, right? And if you didn't have the money, well, I'm sorry, there were a few scholarships, but it was not easy. It was not easy for them to come. So when Mathur contacts my father and says, how would you like to design a school? So my father and he are talking, and they say, well, we want it to be open to everybody from the villages, from the towns, not only the people who can afford it, but people who can, whatever. As long as they're bright, we want to give them the opportunity to become leaders of the new India. That was what my father wanted to do. And so in the process, because of Mathur, maybe because of my father, in the end, the government of Bihar agrees this is a good idea. And my father then goes around Bihar and finds NETARHAT. He finds this perfect place that has a lovely climate and all the things that NETARHAT has, right? So NETARHAT is born. And again, in the meantime, another residential school, which is in Sandur, it's called the Sandur. Again, my father never taught there, but he laid out the plan in a similar way as he did at NETARHAT. My father organized NETARHAT, and then he organized Sandur School. But he was not the Sandur, one of the really good teachers of Rishi Valley would become the person who was the principal and then the education director of the Sandur school, and ran it for 40 years before she retired. So it was, it grew really well, but it was trying to absorb all the things that my father had started in Rishi Valley. Because what my father is doing, and as you will see in the Blue Mountain School, it's a continuous experiment. How do we make it better? How do we make it easier? How do we give children an opportunity that they wouldn't have otherwise? I left for England in 1958. In 1959, my father retires with my mother to Ooty, and of course, he's not well. He's not been well. But people won't leave him alone. They say, start another school. So he starts the Blue Mountain School, and I was telling you about Malti, my aunt. Well, it turns out that my mother, Malti, and her youngest sister, Sushila, they all had extraordinary careers, but that's nothing to do with my father. But it's very interesting that the girls in this family were the ones that shone and did unusual things, let's put it that way. Anyway, Malti, the one who married the Patwardhan prince in 1935-36, she becomes the first Brahmin to divorce a prince. She divorces him and marries Jal Nauroji. Now, Jal Nauroji is the grandson of Dadabhai Nauroji. Some of you might, the name of Dadabhai Nauroji. He was sort of the grandfather of the Indian freedom movement. And Dadabhai Nauroji's grandson, Jal Nauroji, was connected to the Tatars because it's a Parsi thing. And so but unfortunately, the marriage only lasted about 6 months because they misdiagnosed what was going wrong with Jal, and he dies. Within 6 months of them being married, he dies. So it was a great tragedy for my aunt, but it gave her the time and energy essentially to do other things. And she was instrumental actually in the early years of Rishi Valley of being able to help keep it open, because schools take money when you don't have any children, And then eventually she bought the summer palace. It's actually a hunting lodge, it's not a palace, of the Raja of Vijayanagaram in Ooty, which is the base where the Blue Mountain School is. And new added buildings were added, but that's where it is. He died in 1961, and to summarize, what did he do? Hopefully kept the best parts of the British system in creating the Indian public school. He founded the IPSC so that there was a standard. He started the Indian Boy Scouts, became its first commissioner, grew it to 20,000 scouts before it was amalgamated. And every school where he actually was principal, he started something called Astachal. And what it is that all the students get together at about, as the sun is about to set, and it's silence or music for a short period of time, because children, boys and girls, especially at that age, they are always hyper, they have to. So the idea was to teach children how to be quiet. And so, Astachal, we would sit in Rishi Valley. There was a big sandy area. By that time we were in kurta pajama, and we would sit on the floor, on the ground, and there would either be music or just silence for about 5 minutes as we saw the sunset. And every time I go to a school gathering of the Rishi Valley group or the Sindhya group, the one thing they remember is Astachal. They remember that as something that has always been with them. And whenever the old boys get together, at the end of the day, there's Astachal. Everybody gets together and has this few minutes of quiet. Bajrang gets in touch with me and says, you've got to come to NETARHAT. And so I said, well, maybe what I should do is do a sort of pilgrimage and go from school to school to school to school, wherever my father has touched it. And of course, I'll be going to NETARHAT in a couple of weeks. And but Bajrang and his, I guess some of you have contributed to a statue of my father, and I'm looking forward to that visit. But what I thought maybe we could do, since we've got a lot of old boys who have memories from the the high days of NETARHAT, I have two suggestions. One is, clearly, when you all went to school, the opportunity to be in a boarding school and to be in a good boarding school was very limited to a lot of people. And the fact that NETARHAT was created gave a lot of you the opportunity to go to a school which had all those capabilities and characteristics. Today the world has changed, and there are more opportunities for people to send their children to schools in the city they're in, and has less interest to go to NETARHAT. So there are three things that I think we should talk about. One is, how do you make a school like NETARHAT become something that their parent is going to want to send their children to? What is it that has to happen in that school? How do we help parents understand and see the benefit of a boarding school? Because there's something that happens in a boarding school that happens nowhere else. And parents who have not experienced that, they don't really understand that, right? So we have to find a way to be able to transfer that knowledge. That's the first thing. The second thing is, how do we motivate teachers to want to teach in that school? Because if you don't have good teachers, you just have people, going to a job. It's not. Teachers have to. There has to be a passion for good teachers. Good teachers have to have a passion in them. So how do you create that? And then thirdly, when NETARHAT was created, and this is a little controversial, so please forgive me if I am controversial, but when NETARHAT was created, the idea of having a public school was wonderful. But maybe the idea of a public school today being a Hindi medium school may not be the right choice, because if most parents want their children to go to university, and having the benefit of English when you are being in the early years makes a huge difference to the way you will have success at university. So I know it's not what NETARHAT, I know, was a Hindi medium school, but maybe we should be thinking, is this possible to have a school which becomes English medium? Hindi is still important, make it an important second language. Find things to do that energize teachers. Maybe their salaries need, I don't know, all those kinds of things have to be talked about. And how do we make it so that the best parts of NETARHAT come to life again? Because that bonding, that what you all feel here, almost always it's because the parents know that if they go to that school, they'll have an easier trip going to university. And what is that basis? Of course, it has to be a good school, but it has to be English medium, because that's what you use when you go to university. It's whoever has the most fluent is going to have a leg up, is going to have an advantage. And not only that, they're going to have an advantage in the rest of the world, because the most common international language still today is English. What I'm saying is, after the children are in the school, you have to start thinking about what it comes to that child next. Where do you want them to end up? How do you give them the tools to make it easier for them to get into those other things? So I absolutely agree with you, because my father's whole goal that made him want to do this is because he wanted to create a public school that was a true public school, open to everybody. Funding doesn't necessarily have to be only from the government. There are people who are, if they can pay some fees, let them pay some fees. Let them, if they were able to spend the money to send their child to modern school, but the person from the village can't, let them pay a little bit more. What's wrong with a guy who's got enough money to send their child to a school in Delhi? Why can't he pay a little bit more than the person who's starting out, who's coming from a village? I mean,
That was also the
it was that's exactly. But exactly, that was the concept. My father's concept was, you should pay what you can, and if you can't pay, you can still come if you're good, if you're bright. And so I absolutely agree with you. You know,
Merit.
what is stopping parents from wanting to go send their children to NETARHAT? If the what I'm hearing is that they want their children to succeed. So they're going to want to send their children to a school which gives them as many extra points as they can get, right? So how do we combine the two? How do we, maybe we have Hindi for the first 2 years. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. The point I'm trying to make is you have to have, listen, part of being an entrepreneur means that you have to understand that if you don't have a product that has a market, it's not going to sell, right? So it's the same way in a school. It's the same way in a school. If you don't have a product that the parents want, you're not going to sell it, right? So my question to you all is, how do we make the product that is something that parents really want? They're willing to send their children away from home and not send them to Sindhya school, but send them to NETARHAT. What do we have to do to make that special? And maybe it's this combination of Hindi and English. I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying. But what I'm saying is that it's clear that if you don't have teachers that have a fire in their belly, and if you don't have parents who want to send their children, it's not going to succeed. I mean, you've got to have both. I'm suggesting that there is a way to fire up everybody. And it's no different from a product that has to be sold to multiple people. How do you do that? Talk about it. That's the way you do it. And there's nothing better than having a bunch of students here all together who want to help. So find a way to do it.